Everybody, welcome to What's Doing. We're here today with an historian, Gabriel Tennen, who for some reason I can't figure out has decided to work on the Mailer Breslin, Jimmy Breslin campaign, the 51st state, when Norman Mailer ran for mayor of New York City, and my father, Jimmy Breslin, ran for city council president. And by the way, my father was always mad. He said, I should have run for mayor. I should have ran for mayor. However, Mailer had a Harvard education and I didn't. But that was the only criteria that made him better. And he said, Mailer got 30,000 votes. And just remember, I got 50,000.
It was actually a little more. I think Mailer got about 40K and your father got 65, upwards of 65. So about 25,000 more than Mailer.
There you go, Gabriel. Why the hell did you even get interested in this?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I've always been fascinated by New York City's history and its people. I was born in Manhattan. I lived in Queens as a kid, and then moved to suburban New Jersey. And when I was growing up, I began traveling into Manhattan and became consumed by the city's history. And when I was in high school, my father started giving me some Breslin books. So The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight first. Can anybody here play this game? We're both big Mets fans. And my father was actually an avid Breslin reader, and actually a 51st state voter. So he was one of those folks, one of those 40,000 for Mailer, one of those 65,000 for your father. And I moved back to the city for college, and I kept reading Breslin. I started getting into the journalism. I had all of these different collections, The World of Jimmy Breslin and all of those. And to me, he wrote about the city in a way that was inimitable. There was no one that I'd ever read that really wrote like him, that spoke so honestly about the city's streets, its people. His style of writing was really captivating to me. And so when I began my doctorate, I had this idea of working on something related to Breslin, and I realized this campaign is a perfect encapsulation of not only all of these things that were going on in New York in the late 1960s, but America more broadly. But to me, this campaign really represents this really important intervention into debates over urban political power in the United States. And so I wrote my first year doctoral paper on that. I won an award for it, and I thought, why not turn this into my dissertation? And it was a real joy to work on. You know, a lot of these doctoral dissertations, they're very dry. There's nothing you can say about the campaign that was dry at all. And many academic historians pushed back against this idea that I'm going to write a sort of popular history about this campaign, but it worked out perfectly. I received a lot of praise for the dissertation. And to me, again, this really speaks to this unique moment in New York City's history, but also these issues that transcend that moment entirely. And just a personal anecdote. So this is before I was born, but New Year's Day, 1986, while my family was still they were living in downtown Brooklyn at the time, and my parents went into the city with my sister, who was about a year old, and they were pushing her down a stroller down Fifth Avenue. And my father says he saw your dad come out of a building, and he turned his collar up, and he had this big smile on his face. And my father, he's told this story to me many times, but he always says he walked like he owned the city. And I think that is, you know, your dad did, to an extent, he owned the city, right? And there's very few people that have left such a big imprint, and the campaign is just one of the many, many elements that he brought to New York's history.
Did you think, compared to like now, there's a big mayoral race going on, and I can only think of how dreadful it seems we're all tugging at one another and fighting. Did you think that the Mailer Breslin campaign at that time was something just totally refreshing and different, original?
Yeah, I mean, my father, when I talked to him about the campaign, there were a few things that I think drew him to it. I mean, the first was he was a Lindsay supporter, and Lindsay's campaign slogan in 65, before he became mayor in 66, was everybody else is tired and he's fresh, right? And then Lindsay gets into office, and there are these cascading series of crises, right? I mean, beginning with the transit strike, obviously, and your father had this great line about Mike Quill. He said, you know, when Lindsay met with Quill, he said, John Lindsay looked at Mike Quill and saw the past. Mike Quill looked at John Lindsay and saw the Church of England, right? And so it's like speaking to this huge disconnect between this Protestant, very handsome mayor and this Catholic, Jewish, Black, Puerto Rican constituency that he had. But then, you know, the teacher strike, sanitation strike, the sort of unrest of the summer of 1968, right? And so Lindsay didn't seem as fresh by 68, 69. And when your father and Mailer entered the arena, I mean, they ran in the Democratic primary. Obviously, Lindsay was running in the Republican primary. Eventually, he lost that primary to the state senator from Staten Island named John Markey. But your father and Mailer, they were running against, Herman Badillo, who I think they thought was a good guy, but this guy had no original ideas. Your father had this great line on the campaign trail. He said, Badillo was housing commissioner under Wagner, which is like being the lookout on the Titanic, which I think is a brilliant encapsulation of this sort of like tired liberalism that they were running against. But there were other folks. I mean, Wagner, obviously, whose policies had been disproven by that point, by the late 1960s. All of these issues that he had left unattended had came to a fore. They were running against Mario Procaccino, who, is a sort of progenitor of these muscular law and order, what we call now a Reagan Democrat, really. So a really early brand of that. And they mocked Procaccino as well, not only for this idea that the only way to solve the issues of New York was through law and order, but he was this sort of like caricature of a mid-century New York Italian. Your father said at one point, Mario for mayor, no, Mario for waiter, sure, something like that. So, to me, the campaign, it's this marriage of these really brilliant policy proposals, but also these really piercing witticisms that only Mailer and your father could have delivered. They had this line, the other guys are bullshit, the other guys are the joke, right? But the reason they said that is people looked at their campaign, the 51st state, that's crazy. What was crazy to them is all of these issues that eventually led directly to the fiscal crisis in 1975 and the decline of New York in the 70s and 80s. And they said, no, it's bullshit to treat these new, fresh issues with the same tired policies, right? And so, yeah, I think that it was this really exciting moment. And I don't necessarily think, when you spoke to Steinem, she had the classic line from your father, which is, what will you do if you win tomorrow? And he said, I'll demand a recount.
That's Gloria Steinem, who was
Right.
their campaign manager, whom
Exactly.
is a precious woman, the great feminist in America. Which leads me to bring it back to, you had two writers, guys that are bestsellers, Pulitzer Prize winners. At that time, early on in their career, they decided we're going to run for mayor. I'll
Yeah.
never forget in city council president, my mother, the phone rang and they were asking my father all these questions. You're running, you're running, you're running. And she said, you're running for what? She said, we're going on vacation. You're not running for anything. And he was there talking to people. And she said, hang up the effing phone, hang it up. You're making an idiot of yourself. You're not supposed to talk to journalists. What are you, desperate for publicity? My mother and my father were having fights in the house. And I was thinking, my father's running for city council president. What is that? I think he's a writer. What's
Yeah.
going on here? And there he was going out with his tie on and out there on the stumping on the streets. And I just thought it was all crazy. I mean, you didn't think for a moment think this was just a crazy stunt?
My job as a historian is to look at this beyond it being a crazy stunt. I mean, there's a few things that I'd say to that. I mean, first and foremost, you know, there's this idea that this was like a literary lark. And to your point, like your father dressed up in the suit and tie, Mailer got a haircut, which was a really big deal at the time, right? And people were saying, he's trying to make himself more attractive to voters. But it wasn't a stunt in the sense that they never, I think Mailer was an egoist, right? I mean, this guy had an ego the size of North Dakota. I've always said, I got into the project actually because of your father. I read The Naked and the Dead and The Armies of the Night and all the great Mailer works, but I've said I've been in like a tenuous marriage with Norman Mailer for several years, right? Because he's a more difficult person to get around. I mean, elements of misogyny and racism through the white Negro, but also a really difficult person. Your father, to me, seemed like someone who had a huge heart, who made the right enemies, someone who cared deeply about the city and its people. Not to say Mailer didn't, but it wasn't a literary lark in the sense that they never. Mailer thought for a second, maybe I'll win, because that's the kind of person Mailer was. I think your father and Mailer, especially when he got into it, the idea wasn't to win, it was to bring new ideas into political discourse. And they're being writers, they approached the campaign with imagination, right? And I think that what was severely lacking in late 1960s New York, and one could easily make the argument that what's lacking in American politics today, is any sense of political imagination, right? And so it doesn't make sense to face new, novel problems with the same tired policy ideas. And, later on, everything that's been written about the campaign in, the 90s through the present day, it's sort of like, look at this ribald campaign, these witticisms. It was kind of a joke, but kind of serious. You look at the writing from the late 60s, the Village Voice, they say this was one of the most creative, important campaigns run since Franklin Roosevelt, right? I mean, you have Thames TV, a program in Britain, exploring the campaign, saying, none of the other candidates are offering anything important, anything new. Look at these two guys. They're actually offering these really unique ideas. And even years later, as the city tumbles into the fiscal crisis in 1975, you have your father, Mailer, and their campaign manager, Joe Flaherty, who tragically passed away very young. But they go on the Robert McNeil report on PBS, and essentially, McNeil prefaces the entire interview by saying, we're stumbling into this crisis. So far, there have been no good ideas. But 6 years ago, there was this brilliant idea, right? And one could certainly make the argument that what the fiscal crisis forced New York to do, and there's a great book by historian Kim Phillips Fine called Fear City, in which she makes this argument. But essentially, the fiscal crisis took democratic decision-making out of the hands of New Yorkers, right? It placed it in these powerful elite entities, the Municipal Assistance Corporation and others, and it really retooled the city to become this neoliberal, unequal, unaffordable city that we have today. Had the 51st state gone through, there wouldn't have been that taking decision-making out of the hands of New Yorkers, out of the hands of their elected officials. So I look at this campaign not only as a really fun, funny story, but one that the campaign proposals themselves would have been impactful, were important. I mean, to me, that's what it represents. It's a moment of historical contingency. What could have happened?
Very good point, because I'll never forget, I asked my father, I said to him, Pop, what do you mean the 51st state? He goes, what do we need the rest of the state for? We give them all the money. The hell with them. New York should be its own 51st state. And I even believe I told Andrew Cuomo that, and I think they laughed at me. But I'll give you a funny thing. I walked in the bedroom, I must have been 12 or with the campaign, and I go, oh, there were two guys on the bed in pinstripe suits, unconscious. My father and Mela were sleeping on my parents' bed in the afternoon, stone cold out, like snoring it out of it. And I looked at them and I thought to myself, man, if this is what it's like running for politics, I don't want to do it.
Yeah. No,
Two grown men, unconscious.
Right. And, at one point, someone asked Mailer on the campaign trail, he said, is this just like publicity for your next book? And he said, it's much easier for me to write a book than to run for public office, right? I mean, I'm already a Pulitzer Prize winner already. He actually won the Pulitzer Prize on the campaign trail, which is a really sort of interesting anecdote. But, it was easier for them to write than it was for them to run for office. So I don't think this was necessarily for their pure enjoyment and amusement by any stretch of the imagination. And to your point about the 51st state, there's this great line, this comes on the heels of the teachers' strike, right? And so there's all of these movements emanating particularly from communities of color for neighborhood control, for community control. And your father says about the school system, we have a guy coming from a place with more cows than people deciding the fate of our public school system. And so, when I look at the campaign, whether you look at the Electoral College, the makeup of the Senate, whether you look at Albany, which your father referred to on the campaign trail as an upstate sump hole, as the capital of the state of New York, there is this anti-urban bias in American politics. And this, to me, was a way to even the playing field for cities in a very specific way.
Interesting. When you talk about the serious side, I get it, but there's no fun in politics. Name me the last time you got a laugh out of a politician. I mean, they brought fun to it in a city that's supposed to have some fun regardless of everything else.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I mean, these were two characters that were very much of the city. And they delighted.
Can you repeat that? You broke up.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say they delighted.
They brought fun.
Oh, sorry.
They brought fun to politics. They weren't afraid to have a little humor.
Yeah. And I mean, and a lot of the humor served a distinct purpose, right? And so a lot of these witticisms that they came up with on the campaign trail, there's, when talking about the 51st state, the other addendum to that, right, is that each neighborhood would become its own quasi-autonomous municipality, right, with the power to determine school curriculum and policing policy. And we can get more into that, the sort of nuts and bolts of these proposals later. But Mailer, had a line, we can have a Malcolm X Day in Bed-Stuy and a John Birch Day on Staten Island. And that's like it's ridiculous to compare Malcolm X to John Birch, in my opinion. But at the same time, this does speak to the way that these jokes, they weren't jokes for the sake of laughter. They were jokes for the sake of getting a point across, a really important point to me.
They were writers. Give me some of the witticisms that you loved.
Yeah, I mean, some of them, I talked a little bit about Mario for Waiter, God no. There's all sorts of other ones. Let me just pull up a couple. I mean, to me, the what is the most important intervention is really into policing. But your father had this one great line. The reason we got into politics is that we know the one thing we could do better than the other politicians is to lie. At least that's what we thought, but we found out we were hopeless amateurs, right? And so, I mean, that to me is brilliant. But then, there's this great moment that your father has on the campaign trail, and Flaherty actually called it sort of his defining moment. Your father and Mailer, neither of them were particularly popular with the police. Mailer because he had been in constant run-ins with the cops throughout his career. Your father because he wrote, I think, sympathetically about police, but also critical about them in many instances. But he sort of tiptoed this line when they spoke to the John Jay police cadets. And I would like to read just a bit of his speech because I think it's really prescient when it comes to debates over policing today. He said, the way I see the city and the way Mr. Mailer sees the city, when I mention what we're doing about it, there will be no more New York Police Department as we know it. Our idea is to have this city become a state, have the various sections of this city become cities right inside the state, and let them run their own police. The police get all the mistakes of all the people who are supposed to be more important and smarter than us. You've got all the mistakes. You're asked to go out and take care of them, patch up holes made in 40 years of history by congressmen from New York and so on. You're being asked to pay for the actions of union leaders that kept people jobless. And now they say, put it on the little guy, right? And I think if you look, I'm not here to endorse any political candidate, but I think if you look at the rhetoric of the Mamdani campaign around policing, their idea of a Department of Social Welfare speaks directly to this idea that it's not the responsibility of some guy making now, $60K a year as a cop to be a social worker, right? To deal with issues of poverty and addiction. And so I think that they spoke directly to that as well. And I think your father's speech at John Jay was a really crucial moment in the campaign.
Yeah, it's funny. My father was very distrustful of politicians. And when you look at the headlines in the last couple of days around the Adams campaign, my father had a great line. He said, if New York tradition was upheld, the one who got in front in the race would be indicted.
Yeah, I mean, perfect. Absolutely, right? I mean, there is this history of, Mailer said on the campaign trail, we are like the best city in the world with the worst government in the world, right? And New Yorkers deserve a government that they can be proud of because we are a proud people. And so, yeah, they were really, the other thing that I think is so interesting about this campaign is your father, Mailer, they definitely had a really, sense of self-importance for good reason. I mean, these were two of the most crucial writers of the second half of the 20th century. But the idea of the campaign wasn't for them to become kings. It was to deliver democracy to the people of New York. At its essence, the campaign was about the fact that everyday people have the wisdom to make decisions for themselves. And Mailer branded the campaign as one of left conservatism. And what he meant by that is that he acknowledged that there was a need for a redistribution of wealth, a redistribution of resources through a central agency, a central government body. But he also recognized that the decisions about how to spend that money should be made by the people who are affected by it, right? And so this was a campaign about democracy, about putting democracy on steroids to a degree.
Okay, but if they were so good, then why did they lose?
I mean, because I think there are a few reasons why they lost. I mean, first and foremost, it's hard to the title of the collection of articles that Peter Manso releases afterwards is Running Against the Machine. They were running against a machine, right? They were running against the Democratic machine, the holdovers from Tammany Hall. I mean, Tammany was sort of dead and buried by then after DeSapio loses to Koch in 61 and 65 in the Village. But Procaccino is definitely a holdover from that era. So they're up against a lot within the Democratic machinery. But furthermore, my father talked about his parents. They had no idea. These are two Jewish people from the Lower East Side. They have no idea who Norman Mailer is, right? They read Breslin because everyone read Breslin in the city. But I think that Mailer went in with this idea that I'll have this great name recognition again among the people of New York. And it turned out, besides those, flower children and the sort of countercultural set that they attracted at the campaign, there was no cachet for Norman Mailer, right? If you go to Bedford-Stuyvesant or you go to Washington Heights or you go, to Tremont in the Bronx, these were not people who read the armies of the night necessarily. And so I think that this idea of celebrity lending itself to a political campaign is one that's very dangerous. And I think that we see now what happens when you have someone whose entire career is based off of celebrity entering a high office, right? I mean, it doesn't always work out the way that you plan it.
That's funny you brought that up. I was thinking that also, and they didn't want to veer into Trump or that particularly. But I mean, you can look at Al Franken, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the guy in Minnesota. Just so many celebrities wanting to run for office. It
Yeah.
almost becomes like some sort of I don't know, a crutch, an ego thing.
I think so.
And
I think it's definitely an ego thing. I mean, there's this old saying that like Washington is Hollywood for ugly people. And I think that Washington's now attracting some of the more attractive people because they realize that the way government is constituted now, it's a way to make money also, right? I mean, and the thing about, the thing about Donald Trump that I think is very different, and I don't want to necessarily get too into contemporary politics or
Mhm.
alienate any of your viewers or listeners, but, there's nothing. Trump sees himself as the decision maker, right? As the decider, as the person where the buck stops. I mean, one could argue whether or not that's true because he's often not taking culpability for things. But your father and Norman Mailer, they wanted to get elected so that they could give the people more power, right? I don't think that necessarily in Trump's calculations when running for president was, I want to extend democracy for the American people, right? And so there is this real difference between the end goals. And I do think that, your father had this great line the day after the election. They said, how did you feel about running in the election? And he said, I was ashamed to have taken part in any event that caused the saloons to close, right? And so they did approach this with this idea of like, we're not in it to win it necessarily. Again, I think Mailer for a second thought like, I'm Norman Mailer, I'm going to become mayor of New York City. And this is something Mailer toyed with as early as 1961, right? So he had been coming up with this idea to run for mayor for almost a decade at that point. But I think that they did enter it. It's really about putting these new ideas into political discourse, right? Expanding the realm of the politically possible. And you do see some of these elements of the campaign come to fruition after its conclusion, right? I mean, you look at the school boards that Lindsay puts in place afterwards. And I mean, Lindsay had experimented with pilot community control programs. But you do see elements. I mean, they had this idea to shut down all of Manhattan to
Sweet Sundays,
right?
Sweet Sundays.
And Sweet Sunday. Well, the idea was first and foremost, no cars in Manhattan ever, right? And then Sweet Sunday was once a month. They were going to close the city to construction, air travel, right? It was going to be a sort of respite for city
I remember
dwellers.
when my father told me that, and I was thinking, Pop, are you crazy? No cars in the city. This was so novel. I was trying to envision it. I was thinking, well, maybe it's kind of nice. Everybody just walks. uh,
Yeah,
Pre-bike lanes, if you will,
right.
pedestrian paths.
And that, I mean, you look at Times Square now, you look at 14th Street is shut to all but buses. Like, to a lesser degree, these have come to fruition. You mentioned, city bikes. One of their proposals, and they had this great miscellany of proposals as well, these smaller proposals. I mean, one was to reinstate Muhammad Ali or recognize him as the heavyweight champion of the world after that title was stripped. So it's also speaking to the time directly. But they said they had an idea, free bicycles in all city parks, right? And this is 40 some odd years before city bikes come to fruition. So they were very prescient about not only urban political power, not only the right of the people of New York to make their own decisions, but also about reclaiming the city from automobiles, reclaiming the city from destructive elements of urban renewal that were often done in really anti-democratic measures. It was about a reclamation of the city for the people of the city. And so there are all these different things, again, that have come to fruition now that may be a watered down version of what they wanted, but that doesn't make the campaign any less important for imagining those ideas decades before any element of them became truth.
That's interesting you say that. Maybe it would spur somebody else with a personality and someone who does something outside of politics to say, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and get involved and do it also as civic responsibility as opposed to what we deal with now, career politicians in New York. And if you look at their track record, they're not very good.
No, no, they're not. They're not. And,
And they're
you know,
boring. They're
they're,
boring, and they've made the city a bore.
yeah,
And they're
yeah,
pompous, and they start talking down to us and demean everyone. And I don't think my father would ever do that with any New Yorker. And Baylor, I can't speak for him, but I know my father's proclivity, and that was passion for the people. And I sense that has disappeared, especially in this current race. Maybe Mondani is trying to push for that in a new way. But other than that, I'm very, very unimpressed with what I'm listening to for the last 6 months.
yeah. And I mean, I think that the problems in New York aren't quite the same that they were in 1969, right? I mean, on the one level, we're not dealing with this rapid deindustrialization, population loss that's going on in 1969. But we're dealing with issues that are really just as daunting in terms of affordability, in terms of being able to raise a family in New York, right? And so I think it's ridiculous for some of these candidates to come to New Yorkers and say, you know, I'm going to solve all of these issues that are squeezing the life out of the New York that we know and love. And I'm going to solve them with policies that have been disproven in the past, right? And that's what your father and Mailer were saying, is that we can't go back to these policies that have already failed us, right? We have to, I mean, the idea of people think of radical politics as like completely outside the box, pushing for something that's impossible. The word radical comes from root. It's attacking the root causes of the problem, right? And so I think that this was a radical political campaign in the sense that it attacked what they saw as the biggest issue facing New York, which was a lack of autonomy. I spoke to Ken Sunshine, who I know you had on your podcast, and you put me in touch with him when I was doing my dissertation. And he had this anecdote when he was working for Dinkins. You couldn't change a street light in New York without asking for permission from Albany. Why are we in the greatest city in the country, arguably the greatest city in the world, going to what your father again called this upstate sump hole to change a street light? Like it's ridiculous. And so it's about New Yorkers determining their own destiny, but also allowing them to do so by rethinking the political system, not in a way that's going to tear down the United States, not in a way that's going to tear down everything about New York, but in a way that's going to enhance what's good about New York. And that is ideological diversity. That is a diversity of different languages and cultures and people. And you said your father would never talk down New Yorkers. There's this great scene, some footage of him walking along 125th Street, and he's joking with all of these different folks on 125th Street. And he says to this one old woman, he says, you should vote for us because we're going to get these white folks out of your hair. And, you can do a lot better than these folks downtown are doing, right? And this is like an honesty that most politicians would never approach constituents with, right? It's not about, it's about us solving your problems. It's not about you solving your problems.
That's a very good point. And it used a key word there, honesty. My father called it a wounded and tormented city at that time. And even now, you could say it's a wounded and tormented city. But I don't believe that the politicians, well, they'll tell you otherwise, are really as honest as they say they are. And I don't think they care about the city. I know my father deeply cared about this city to the point where it was unusual. And maybe that was the key to his great success, his love for the city and the people and respect. Do you
Yeah.
see that now, or did you even yourself realize, wow, Breslin had some real intrinsic, he cared.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of humanism that's missing from our politics, right? This idea that we are all, joined because we are all facing the same fate. Like there is a humanity to New Yorkers, a humanity to all human beings, that we're all connected. And, it's funny you say that about your father because your father and his new journalism. So, academic history today is not quite as concerned with the big movers and shakers as it was in the past. There's been what we call in the field of history a social turn. And that social turn means rather than study presidents and generals, we're going to study everyday people and the way that they shape history. Academic history today is far more concerned with the Clifton Pollards of the world than it is concerned with the visiting dignitaries of the world. Your father recognized that it's everyday human beings, the struggle of everyday human beings that makes the world turn. And so, as a historian, I mean, I'm writing about these two successful, well known writers, but I'm writing about them because they recognize elements of humanity, elements of the fact that it's everyday people who allow our city to function, who actually make our city great, who make our country great, right? And so, your father, to a degree, he invents this new brand of journalism focused on everyday people that now in the 21st century, if you go to universities and study for a PhD in history, you are taught that is how to view the world, the way that your father viewed the world.
Well, my father said something very salient, very caring. He said, the city either gets an imagination or it dies. I think it was relevant then, and it's certainly relevant right as we speak with one another here.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think it's beyond even the city gets an imagination or it dies. It's, every political leader across the globe. And we're looking at a world that's even more interconnected now than it was in 1969. So I think if COVID was a dress rehearsal for international cooperation and political imagination, our world failed that test spectacularly. But these issues facing the globe, climate change, war, all of these different things, they will require not only cooperation, but imagination. We can't face the problems of the future with the solutions of the past. And that, to me, was the general thrust of the 51st State campaign.
Wow. Well, let me ask you a couple of quick things here. Did you get one little thing out of so far all the research and work you've done saying, wow, it's worth me doing this? One little thing you might have learned from Breslin, one thing, one humorous thing maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot from your father, right? I mean, to me, your father was someone who also had an element of humility. And I know he's not known for his humility, but there's this one anecdote that he writes about on the campaign trail where he's at a Democratic club on, I think, the Upper West Side. And he's, giving this lecture to this room full of mostly white people about the fact that we have to give Black communities the ability to determine their own future and all this stuff. And he sees this sole Black woman nodding in the back. And he says, right on, I'm on point. I'm reaching the people I want to reach. And then he looks over and it turns out she's on a sewing machine bouncing up and down, right? So she's not actually nodding her head at him. And so there's this element of humility to also recognize that, like, I can't do it alone. Like, I might not always be right, but I am always going to stand by my convictions of what I think is true and good. And that's something that I think I learned a lot from your father. I think I also learned from the campaign the fact that, a lot of these things are still so wildly relevant today. Your father at one point said, he's writing about the campaign afterwards, and he says, 50 years from now, they'll be talking in college classrooms about what Mailer and I were doing on the campaign. And it took me a little more than 50 years to start bringing this up in college classrooms, but we're still under 60 years, so right on schedule. Your father was always prescient. And I think that it does illustrate for my students, for my readers, that this is an idea that's worth resuscitating. I mean, if you look right now at what's going on in Washington, D.C., right? I mean, Washington, D.C. is the case study for the anti-urban bias in American politics. And I think if you ask your father, the reason that the United States is so anti-urban, when he was growing up, it was the home of the urban other, right? Like Jews, Irish, Italians. By the 60s, it's Black folks and Puerto Ricans. Now it's immigrant communities from all over the world, Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And so there is this anti-urban bias against people living in cities. You look at what's going on in DC right now. If DC were a state, there would not be National Guard troops as freely roaming the streets and occupying the city as they are today, right? I mean, DC is the case study for why we need more urban political power in the United States. New York City has nearly 8.7 million people right now. North Dakota has like 3 million people. How in God's name do I have the same number of senators representing me that the people in North Dakota do? Now, that's no That's no insult to North Dakota, you know. And I think that what your father also recognized is to each their own, right? If you want to live in an urban area, you can live in a city. If you want to live in a rural area, there's no shame to that. And that's as good of a lifestyle. But we do have to recognize that there is an uneven playing field and one that allows for a tyranny of the minority in many ways, for people living in cities to be ruled by people who are not only ambivalent towards cities, but often hostile towards cities.
No, I understand. I understand. Well, you know, I first off really appreciate your insight into this campaign, which was very unusual, very unique. I don't think I recall any other campaign like it in modern times. But my father always told me, you know, fame is fleeting.
Mm.
It comes fast and goes faster. So I always think that he always had a touch of humor about things. Oh, serious, of course. But I think he was smart enough to realize fame is fleeting, it comes fast and goes faster. And maybe that might be helpful for some of our current flock of politicians to realize.
Yeah, and I think to your point about career politicians, at a certain point when you are removed from the streets and the people, you forget about why you got into that business in the first place, right? And so if you're ensconced in Gracie Mansion for 8 years, if you're in the governor's mansion, if you're in the White House, suddenly you lose sight of why you got into that game to begin with. And a city is more than bridges and schools and roads and subways. A city is nothing without the people who use that infrastructure. And I think your father was acutely aware that New York is a city of people. It's not a city of infrastructure and buildings, right? That's nothing without the people who make the city what it is. And so, this keen sense that it's the people that are important, right? And it's the people's wants and needs that are important. And frankly, it's the people who are wise enough to make decisions for themselves if they are given the knowledge and tools to do so.
Yep, I believe he said after you leave New York, you ain't going anywhere.
Classic, classic. You know, and when you bring up your father's lack of a college education, but this reminds me of a few things about, you know, I think we probably both have this huge admiration for Al Smith. I know your father did, who was obviously governor of New York for much of the 1920s. Al Smith didn't have a college education either. And when he was campaigning, people would say, "Where'd you go to school?" And he'd say, "FFM, Fulton Fish Market." That's where he went to college, right? And so I think that there's also this idea that you need a formal education. I mean, look, I have a doctorate. I'm someone who's gone through the steps of formal schooling. I don't think that makes me better than anyone by any stretch of the imagination. I just had different passions and a different, you know, trajectory to pursue that goal. And I think Al Smith is illustrative of the fact that you don't need to be a career politician with all of these credentials to care about the people and impact their lives. Your father was case in point. You don't need a journalism degree to be the greatest journalist that this city might have ever known, in a city full of great journalists, right? And so I think we also have to start valuing what people bring to the table, regardless of their credentials. And oftentimes it's those with fewer credentials that are more keenly aware of the issues facing them and their communities.
Wow, I agree with you. Well, you know, first off, I can't thank you, Gabe, enough for your insight here because I think we've just given people enough to realize, wow, maybe I should go back and read all about the 51st state, Mayor Breslin, the improbable campaign. And I'm glad it hit a, a chord in you where you decided to keep writing about it and tell people about it. And I know we look forward to whatever writing you have. And I appreciate your time so much. I guess you must have really loved these guys.
I do, I really do, and you know, I love your father. To me, he is, you know, there's no one like him in the city today, and New York would be a better place if we had a Breslin today, someone who's actually going to call out those that are picking our pockets, those that are making our lives more difficult, and really highlighting, you know, the goodness of everyday New Yorkers and the qualities that make this city great. And so I really thank you for the time for letting me come on here and talk about it. To me, again, this is
Surely.
really a fascinating campaign led by two characters that are unlike any people that came before or after them. And I think that, I'd like to, continue to resuscitate this campaign, and hopefully more people can be inspired by their ideas and their rhetoric and their histories, because your father is a really inspiring person to me.
Well, then we'll leave it with my father's line. Either New York, the city either gets an imagination or it dies.
Let's get an imagination then, folks.
Well, then, thank you so much, Gabe, and we'll talk to you again sometime.
Thank you so much.